Hey everybody, welcome to Written and Watched. My name is Justin, and I'm going to be your host as usual. Today with us we have Ryan. He's got his own podcast network and stuff, and he brought us Annihilation. So we read the book. I read it in an airplane, which was a strange choice on my behalf. Ryan, will you introduce yourself and kind of give a why you thought of Annihilation first off when I made the call for books?
Sure. I'm Ryan, the Unevenflow on Up Nerd Podcast Network, which I do mostly with my wife and other hosts. Anyway, as for why Annihilation, we had done a podcast on it, but frankly, it's one of the more interesting sci-fi books I've read. And when you put out a call looking for books, I thought to myself, well, this is one that's probably a little more out there, maybe, than some of the other ones that you'll get. Turns out I was right and wrong at the same time, but it's an interesting book, and the film was my introduction to it, which I almost feel like I mentioned this on our podcast we did, which is simply on the movie itself, but I almost feel like the film is a good introduction to this book. And
so I'm in the same camp you are for the direction that I read them, because I did see the movie first. So this is my first read, and then when I watch the movie after this, it'll be a rewatch. But I get what you're saying, because there's visual representations and kind of a structural idea that is pretty easy to manifest on screen. And the book has a weird shape because of the way it's presented.
You'd think so to a certain extent, but I like to think of a lot of the book about sort of beauty and desolation. Okay. Or you've probably seen, or people have probably seen on YouTube, shorts or pictures of people exploring, abandoned buildings or something that's been overrun by nature. And that's a lot of the iconography of the book, I find, at least. Yeah. But having said that, you mentioned you read this on an airplane ride. This is close to my experience with it. I watched the movie when I was over in New Zealand visiting family. And I realized, okay, I really want to read these books. So I picked them up and I went to read them, but I wanted to finish. I was reading Tiamat's Wrath, the 8th book of the Expanse series at the time. Yeah. So I wanted to finish it first. But when I got home, I absolutely blasted through Annihilation, the book. And I say that there's a lot of iconography and brief description of sort of beauty out of nature. Yeah. And nature overtaking things in a lot of places. Yeah. There's next to no time to breathe in the book, though. It's such a quick read.
It's very quick, yeah.
It's 127
it just
pages.
Clips along. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't realize it was that short, and that's me reading on Kindle, but I did read it pretty quick. Like, it was in one flight, so I up and downed it.
Yeah, there's a 4th book out now. This is the trilogy book. The first portion, that's Annihilation. This is the other 2 books. There's now a 4th one out, which I've also read. But it moves rapidly, more so than I think almost any other science fiction book I've read, or cosmic horror or anything else. I find it's just breakneck.
I think there's some, and people are going to get pissed because I keep referencing Heinlein, but there's Citizen of the Galaxy is something that I think runs at a fast pace, but that's a young adult book. Yeah. So this has almost the velocity of a young adult book with gorgeous prose and really more adult themes than you get in any of that. But it has this compelling push that you almost get in airport books like Da Vinci Code. Yeah. But because of the curiosity that starts to like infuse itself inside of you, you're searching to both understand what's happening in the prose and what's actually happening.
And it's told from the singular viewpoint, too, which, I mean, helps it go along so quickly. Combined with, we do get a fair amount of the unreliable narrator trope. Yes. To the point that the narrator repeatedly tells the reader that in more than a couple sections that, they're probably being influenced by things. And
So let's back up before we hit like the structure of it, because we should give some background and space for this. So this is a 2014 novel by Jeff Vandermeer. It won a bunch of awards when it came out. People really, really loved it, and there's a couple of people that really, really hated it. So it's a very polarizing book on the scene. If you go read reviews, and you go read like professional reviews too. It's now one of 4 books in what's called the Southern Reach series. And the Southern Reach series is all about this same kind of jungly space called the Southern Reach. And it's based extremely loosely, but inspired by a stretch of Florida, a 14-mile hiking path in Florida that Jeff walked repeatedly. And so with that kind of surrounding the book's text, it's very much about the decay of us and our things and the rise of nature in opposition. But then it has like what you're talking about, this whole. So do you want to kind of frame up the plot? Because I feel like we need that to really kind of start. Because the plot's super simple, like not a lot happens.
Yeah, it's very basic. It reminds me a lot of, I had this discussion once about just some of the best science fiction can be summed up in only a few sentences. And this falls into that. Anyway, this follows Expedition 12 into Area X of the Southern Reach area. It contains 4 women. We are introduced early on, and the book is told from the viewpoint of the biologist, who, if you've ever seen the film, is the Natalie Portman character. But it's told from her viewpoint. And it follows them into Area X as they were given very little information. And as we very quickly learn, next to no accurate information on what's contained within. Interspersed with this are some very well-timed, I felt, flashbacks to her life before venturing into Area X, in which we learn that her husband was a part of the 11th expedition into Area X, and he returned from it, in a sense. We learn that nobody really returns from Area X, because what follows is encounter after encounter of essentially the unknowable.
Yeah.
And it was gripping from the start, because you open immediately with them in Area X and coming upon what she calls the tower, but is actually a tunnel into the ground.
Yeah. Which is it's a huge topic of discussion online, but it comes down to this idea that there's this whole inversion of perception, and there's this whole inversion of reality that's kind of taking place and manifesting in X for the biologist. Now, with her being the one who's journal we're reading, we only get her point of view.
Yep.
I think that's something the book really holds onto and keeps forcing her to be less and less reliable of a narrator. Her opinions change. Her remembrance of her husband shifts through the thing. She's like, oh, I remembered another thing that I'd forgotten earlier, but now I remember it. And you don't know if she's actually remember it or if she's reconstructing her narrative to fit what she's experiencing and to kind of retell her own story, which is just fucking crazy. Excuse me, freaking crazy. I'm trying not to cuss too much on these. I mean, you can go ahead, but it's just
fair.
Easier.
Like I mentioned before, it's essentially unknowable, and her remembrances and these sequences we get of the outside world beforehand may just be her trying to contextualize what she's seeing at the time. It's so crazy. So, I mean, they venture forth. They eventually go down into the tower. She investigates writing on the walls. The writing, by the way, is in English randomly, and the writing is made up of flora.
It's alive. Yeah, it's a living script.
It's a living biome, essentially, we will learn. And she is infected by the spores. And this is the first sort of it's the first indication of the infection of Area X into somebody, although we kind of learn later on that it's been influencing everybody really from the start.
Yeah. And everything inside of it. It's not just people that it affects either. There's all kinds of flora and fauna that are just different. And it's really good at not saying it's different because it has 3 leaves in a group instead of 2 or anything specific like that. As a biologist, she kind of describes it as being separate and unnatural in it's a very strong prose voice where they don't actually say it had 3 legs instead of 4. It's very feeling-y.
I should note, too, that the timing of the book is somewhat in question in terms of when it is set accurately in relation to our time. However, they enter with severely outdated technology, as in there's no cell phones. Yeah. So we learn that cell phones are a thing whenever this is set. But nobody has a cell phone or satellite phone. Nobody has a modern-day camera. They have just the old photography, and you need a darkroom to develop it.
Yeah, they have to develop it.
There's no camcorders. Now, we do learn eventually that camcorders were at one point there. We don't find out in this book why not, or why they didn't bring any modern equipment with them. But everybody just has older equipment for whatever reason.
Yeah, and there's this strangeness to the way they structure that too, because there's an organization that's sending groups in on these expeditions, and that organization is pretty nameless, faceless, and motivations unknown. It's they want to know more about X, but they don't really go over why. And it looks like X's boundaries is pushing out slowly, so it may be a containment thing. But we don't really know what the organization is or what their goal is in sending these expeditions are, but they are doing it by trial and error. They'll send a group in, see what works, and then change it on the next group. Yep. And earlier groups are reported to have killed each other, so they didn't have guns for a while, and then people weren't coming back, and then they had one expedition that lasted like quite a while. Like, it's super interesting, the little bit that she knows about the prior expeditions and how that kind of informs what she expects of this one.
And
weird.
Yeah, and as we move on, after the first night, after the visit to the tunnel or tower, depending on which character you want to listen to, but the anthropologist is suddenly gone, and now we're down to 3.
Yeah.
And the psychologist is seemingly wounded. We'll find out why a little bit later on, but they're told that, oh, okay, there's no, we're down to 3 now. And my producer has decided to visit, and she moves on. That is producer Harley Cat, for anyone who listens to the podcast, who makes herself known during it. But, so they're down to 3 at this point, and the exploration continues with just the biologist and the surveyor. So the initial team is the biologist, a surveyor, an anthropologist, and then the psychologist is sort of the leader of the group.
Yeah.
The psychologist stays outside while the surveyor, and the biologist go down. And it's at this point that we discover things are even worse than we thought. Because they discover the corpse of the anthropologist further down within the tunnel, and the corpse has been mangled. It is covered in type of biology similar to what's on the walls in a lot of ways, I think.
And it's bioluminescent, isn't it? She's glowing.
Yes. There is a glow to it, yeah.
Yeah. That's something that comes into here, and as the story progresses, the glow takes on its own kind of importance for the different characters. Like where the glow is coming from, what's glowing, why it's glowing. It takes on its own little space. To mention about the psychologist too, and I think we can drop this in here, is the psychologist has pre-programmed phrases she can use to help people sleep and help people stay in line and kind of control. So when you talk about her as a leader, she feels like one of the only extensions of the organization into X, where the other three are really there to collect data and kind of be a part of the experiment. The psychologist's motivations and connections to X are left very unclear, but because she has this ability to control the others to some degree, especially around sleep and compliance, she's very much an arm of the X organization. And when I started reading that, and that started to come out where she was just able to be like, yeah, it's bedtime, everybody's going to bed, and then putting them into compliance, that was one of the first times that I got really not just unreliable narrator for the biologist, but unreliable narrator of the organization to the biologist. Like, it started making me question if they're giving them this old antiquated gear and they are able to psychologically prepare them so that they're all shut down when they cross the border into X. Nobody knows what happened when they crossed in. They just know they can't leave now. So with that kind of manipulation, you've got this really weird organization that kind of X-Files needs to go investigate and figure out what the heck's going on in these backroom guys.
It sounds like a great vacation.
It is such a strange...
Great vacation. Good time for everybody. Yeah. And we should note, too, the biologist, it is revealed, is now immune to any of the psychological triggers or the hypnotic suggestion after
once she's exposed to
the spores enter her.
Yeah. And that's where we really find out that that's how she controls him. So she's faking it. She's faking being controlled, which is...
And it's at this point that they discover, the anthropologist is deceased. There's something within that tower or tunnel that has killed her. Something, again, very sort of unknowable. It leaves a translucent trail behind it, covered in sort of what looks like cilia to move and propel itself.
And it looks like it's the one that's writing the words on the walls of the stairway.
Yeah. Because something has to be.
Something has to be. It's not organically just showing up. So at this point, they switch and they move towards the actual goal of their expedition, which is the lighthouse. But at the same time, you've got this tension between the remaining portions, and nobody trusts each other anymore.
Yeah,
it's all falling apart once they find the anthropologist.
Yeah, which is two of them at this point, and the big issue comes from the biologist attempts to use one of the trigger words, or phrases, I should say, on the surveyor. The issue with that is it doesn't work. It only seems to work for the psychologist, but she is aware that someone has just tried to control her, which is a great way to erode trust in somebody else. So, for obvious reasons, she's not going to pay much attention to the biologist anymore.
No. And the biologist is trying to convince her that that was true for a second. She's like, no, the psychologist is doing this. Here's what's happening.
Yeah.
But it's too late. She's already broken trust with her. And so now everybody's kind of in their own pocket. The psychologist is gone at this point, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so the psychologist is gone. It's just the anthropologist and the biologist, and they're at odds.
Surveyor
so
and the biologist
sets off. Surveyor and the biologist, right? Anthropologist is the first one to die. It's really hard because they don't name the characters and they give them their job role titles. Mm-hmm. There's no names, so that you don't know too much about anybody. You're just there for the job. It's very utilitarian use of people.
There's descriptions
as a probe
between both the biologist and it's hinted at by the psychologist that names here have power. And it's another hint that we really don't understand Area X, as it's called, at all.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so weird. The bit on the wall, do you
Here
have the
lies
passage
the
there?
strangling
There it is.
fruit.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's here lies the strangling fruit, and then I cannot remember the rest of it. Beyond that, it extends quite a ways, and I will not give away anything regarding future books or the reasoning. But when you read it, it very much sounds almost biblical. There are sort of references to being born in fire. It feels like it would be a passage out of something.
Yeah. Here, I got it. I'm going to read a little bit of it, not the whole thing, because it's a pretty long
it goes
passage.
For a while.
And it's fun to read it. But just to give you an idea of how it sounds, and there's two things that I think of when I read this. One of them is right with you in the biblical space. The other one is the Lovecraftian weirdness that he has with structured words, like his bizarre choice of chthonic and strange stuff in there. So the quote goes, and this is what's written on the wall with the glowing stuff. It says, "Where lies the strangling fruit that came from the land of the sinner? I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead to share with the worms that gather in the darkness and surround the world with the power of their lives, while from the dim-lit halls of other places, forms that never were and never could be." And it goes on. There is no real break in it. It just goes and goes and goes. And it's just disturbing. It's disquieting. It's massively disquieting, and it sets this unease in that is already set from the biologist's description of the weirdness, the otherness, being pushed into this land of X under hypnotic suggestion, like all of the stuff that leads up to this. And then you get this passage, and you go, this is so weird. Like, this is such good modern cosmic horror writing. Like, it's fantastic. It's so bizarre. And it just kind of tripped my brain when I was reading it. I think I read it 3 or 4 times before I moved on, trying to make sense.
And I mentioned that, it sounds like a biblical passage or something along those lines. It's that melding of the familiar and something just completely unknowable. It's very much gibberish. You can try to infer meaning from portions of it, but you'll only get so far, and before you kind of hit a wall. It's just, it was fascinating to me.
In that, though, it has the same thing that Lewis Carroll did in the Jabberwocky, where all of the sentence words seem to be in the right place for the structure, and you feel like you're pulling meaning out of it, even though it doesn't have inherent meaning, right? So the "'twas brillig and the slidey toves, the gyre and gimble in the wabe," all of the things feel like verbs and adverbs and stuff.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean anything.
Well, and indeed our narrator at certain points, based on what's happening to her, pulls meaning from it. But as you said before, it's very contextual at the time, and it's just certain portions pulled out. And
to sit back on the unreliable narrator portion of this, too, is we don't know if that's what's actually written on the wall or what she reads as written in the wall. Because this is the point where she starts to shift and gets that infection and starts to become other. So let's talk a little bit about the people that do come out of X, right? So there have been several people from the expeditions that come out. And they are the person. They look like the person. They test as the person. But their personalities are like they don't remember being themselves. They're like weird automatons. And her husband is the best example of that because he's the one we get most exposed to. And when he first comes out, he's kept in like quarantine. And then eventually they release. Oh, wait, he comes out and he goes directly to the house.
Yep.
They see each other again. It's super weird. She initiates sex to try and figure out if it, like, he's been gone so long, what's going on?
As you do,
and
of
then,
course. No.
Hey, my husband's back and he's really weird. This is a new kink. She's my lover.
New king who this, yeah. Anyway.
New king who this. So then the agency comes to take him away and study him and quarantine him. And so she goes to visit him in the thing, and that's when she kind of starts going, okay, I'm going to go into X now and figure out what happened to my husband.
And should be noted, he and everyone else that came back from that 11th expedition died 6 months later at the same time.
Yeah,
and
they
they're
don't
told
stay alive.
they're told, or we as the reader and the biologist, I would assume, are told that, oh, it was cancer. But as with anything else, how believable is any of that?
Yeah, and there's I think the biologist has two kind of profound arcs. One is this thing that the infection is doing to her, and she's a biologist, but she never goes, it's a bacteria, it's a virus, it's a fungus. She never really identifies it. It's just a change to her, and she slowly becomes more and more luminescent, and more and more.
She refers to it as the brightness.
Yeah, which is very much in line with, like, when I read that, I also thought of like The Shining and kind of that carried around glow, except this one's very much a physical glow where it gets her shot at because she can be seen at one point. Like she's glowing. She's a shiny little girl. But so she's got that arc where she's kind of changing her relationship to nature and her relationship to the other people. And then at the same time, she's unpacking and reevaluating her relationship with her husband, which wasn't great.
No.
There's the passage too when she's doing flashbacks, and this really speaks to the first arc, the one where she's becoming more like nature and more like the Area X, is where when she was a kid they had a pool and the pool went to rot and they just let things grow in it. So it was full of bugs and frogs and birds and plants, and it was this swampy cess of a pool, which that'll definitely kick you an infection if you're swimming in that one. But that pool for her is why she becomes a biologist, and eventually the pool gets cleaned and everything's taken out of it, and now she's in this place in X where all of the human things are being taken out of, and nature is taking it back, kind of. So I feel like it's an inversion of her little origin story, right? Like, do you have a read on that? How do those two things fit for you?
I completely agree. And there is a segment, later on, where I feel like it's made clear, that inversion, because she likens an experience that happens to her to being that starfish in her beloved ecosystem and being studied by this larger thing. In her case, it's her.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
But that experience gets brought up to her in the sense that she is the item being studied. And I feel like, that just kind of made it 100% clear that that's what's going on. It's that inversion of nature, man versus nature, in a lot of ways.
So this text kind of has that effect on me where I lose track of what happened when and what's happening now. There's even some times where her tense changes. And so it feels like she's writing in the journal as it happens. Now I'm doing this. And then it switches back into past tense. So it's almost like she's recording it of two minds or two personalities. But the encounter, you're talking about the encounter with the crawler. Is that before or after they go to the lighthouse?
After.
Okay, so
at our point where we are presently in terms of the story, she has broken off with the surveyor who does not trust her. The biologist decides to go to the lighthouse at this point, it being the only real item on the map that has not been explored by her at this point. So she heads to the lighthouse. The lighthouse has just a number of discoveries. Everything from there was some sort
Yeah.
of consistent attack from the sea to the lighthouse has become some sort of defensible position to
Yeah.
the interior of the lighthouse is covered with blood and has bodies in it, and some things have happened there, to the final sort of revelation, which is this is not the 12th expedition.
Yeah.
This is the 100th and some odd probably expedition.
It's
We're never given a clear number, but there
she
are
just
journals.
finds a giant stack of journals hidden under the floorboards.
In a 4x4 door.
Yeah.
In the floor, and there's a stack of,
and
I think it's estimated around
ones,
16 feet or so wide of journals.
Yeah. And the oldest ones are like decomposing. They've been there so long.
They've rotted,
so she can only really
there's
read the more
bugs in
recent
them.
stuff. Oh, and she also on like the first floor when she first comes into the lighthouse, there's a picture of the lighthouse keeper on the wall, and she takes it with her.
Yes.
Because she's like, this guy looks like he's warning me about something or means something. I'm going to take his picture with
the
me.
Lighthouse keeper has been circled in that picture.
Yeah.
There's a lighthouse keeper, there's a little girl, and somebody else in the picture. None of that, well, I shouldn't say none of that. One of those is made clear by the end of this book. For the others, you'll have to read forward. But, yeah, and so she
How far can the southern reach?
Yeah, so she pockets that picture. You're right, and that's when she goes up and eventually discovers the area, and it's at this point that she reads a number of the journals. She also, by the way, pockets, of course, her husband's journal to read later.
Yeah.
And
that pickup, like that kind of conversation and stuff, it's really haunting because you feel like there should be something in the lighthouse with how much has happened. The blood, the fortification, the kind of it looks like recent stuff has happened there. Things have broken. Things have been overturned. There's disturbances
spent ammunition everywhere. There's
spots where people camped that are marked out in the dust. There's footprints. Like it seems to have recently been active. And so it's just super tense as a read.
But really, there's nothing there. I mean, our revelation we are treated to, at least initially, is that, okay, there have been expeditions coming here for a significant amount of time. And it's also through this reading that she discovers that even before there was an Area X, there were some odd goings-on in this area, that there were expeditions being sent even before there was a border to it, and to try to see what was going on.
Yeah, and this is the point at which she re-encounters the psychologist, right?
The psychologist is found at the foot of the lighthouse, having jumped off of the edge during the time that the biologist was coming up the stairs to it. There was just there was an intense urge. So we're discovered through conversation. First of all, initially, the psychologist speaks the title of the book to her a number of times. Annihilation. Yeah. And we eventually, we've discovered that that's the code word to terminate yourself through the hypnotic suggestions. But of course, it doesn't work on the biologist.
Because she's shiny.
Yeah. Shiny to the point that the psychologist mentions she was able to see her coming through the darkness towards the lighthouse, but she was unable to fire. She wanted to shoot her, but she couldn't. And she tried, but she just was not allowed to through something.
So do you think she got somewhat infected too and is being controlled? Or is she just being controlled somehow?
So it becomes clear after she dies when the biologist does a very quick sort of look through on her and an autopsy on her, she finds that during the exchange where the anthropologist was killed by whatever is in the tower, the psychologist was indeed injured. She didn't just look injured the day after she was. Her shoulder in particular had a significant gash in it, but that gash is covered by spores and flora and different sort of plant life. So she had been changing as well. And the psychologist also mentions it to her when they're speaking, that 2 members of this team of 4 were compromised almost immediately. So she was somewhat aware, I think, that something was up with the biologist early on. And she certainly knew she got compromised in the encounter with whatever it was at this point that's in that tunnel. So I think,
she's calling it the crawler at this point, right?
Yes, she's given it a name. That's true. Yeah, so it is called the crawler already. So we can call it that. Yeah. And what's weird is that the lighthouse is the only actual tower in this area. Mm-hmm. And it's always called the lighthouse. It's never called a tower. It's never described as being towering over anything. It's just called the lighthouse over and over again. Like, she's called the biologist and there's the psychologist. Like, the name is the function, which makes me think about how she thinks of the tower that's actually a tunnel. Is that name might be because of what its purpose is instead of what it actually is. Well, you mentioned the inversion as well, too. And it's after this point that the biologist returns to the camp, having left the corpse of the psychologist behind, which is now bioluminescent and glowing in the darkness. And she has an encounter with the surveyor, which I'll get to, but I will mention it's after that she returns to the tunnel/tower. And she actually mentions later on, as she reaches towards the bottom, or what she thinks might be the bottom of this tunnel, that it feels like an inversion of the lighthouse, that the steps have become similar in terms of spacing and in terms of their feel to it.
Yeah, and it's also when she's coming back to her encounter and coming back to go into the tunnel again, there's that weird bit where she encounters something that's huge and monstrous and pursuing her through the waters and the trails that we never really see. It's just heard, right?
Yeah, it's a moaning beast that's heard throughout the book. And it begins early on. They actually have some drinks on that first night that they're aware or awake for, and they mock it, but it essentially responds, which they immediately decide, okay, maybe we won't make noises at this thing. And she has an encounter with it on the way back. We're never seeing it. However, we do find the molted face of the 11th Expedition's psychologist, along with molted skin, essentially, that almost looks human. Seemingly coming from this creature, perhaps, or we have no idea, but it's another sort of what is going on here moment.
Big style. So, okay, it's so strange. And for those of you that haven't read it, I can't recommend this book enough. You should go read it. But it is so surreal when there's not answers in the book. The text leaves you alone with these weird encounters, weird visions, weird things happening, and it just gives them to you and goes, these mean something, but we're not telling you why.
Yeah, figure it out. Think, stupid, think.
But which is where I think that cosmic horror stuff really sits, because it's unknown known. It's you know what's happening, but there's no reason for it. There's no logical, normal contrivance that explains and sets this up. Even just trying to explain the X missions is hard because you don't really know the organization or how they program them, or if they wipe their brain and give them fake memories before they go. Like maybe they tell everybody, hey, your husband was on the last mission. Your wife was on the last mission. They could do that and test to see if it does something.
Did they even
so
have
she
a
might not
husband
even
or
have
wife?
been with this guy. Say again?
Did they even have a husband or wife?
Right.
Yeah.
Like it gets so...
It's very...
so,
yeah.
There's no hold on to in this. There's such loose, slippery, effervescent bits that just kind of slip together in a strange puzzle that sits with you for quite a while. To be honest.
And that's what I like. The book doesn't... I mentioned before, the book is at a breakneck speed, and there's almost no time to breathe.
Yeah.
You've got to take your own time to kind of process things.
Yeah.
And put it down for a second and think about what this means.
Well, it really fits the shape of forcing you to almost be on the expedition with her, because she has a time limit. It's super dangerous. She's got to figure out enough stuff to try and figure out how to get this information back. So she's recording it, the journal, she's taking photographs, and all this stuff is supposed to get back to the organization somehow, but she doesn't know how. Mm-hmm. Like theoretically, the psychologist does know how to get the materials out, but not them. It's implied, but it's never explained. So she has no way to get this stuff back out, but she keeps doing it anyway.
Also, I mean, yeah, the presence of the journals shows that they have no idea how to get things out, at least in theory, either, because there's just a stack of hundreds and hundreds of journals sitting there that seemingly nobody has read or been able to return data from.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go to the weird kind of space in the book, and that's the crawler final encounter and run around in the tower tunnel.
Yeah,
right?
So after an encounter with the surveyor where she's forced to kill the surveyor, we discover, by the way, that the anthropologist and possibly others returned to the surveyor during the time the biologist was gone, which means that Area X is indeed creating some form of doppelganger. And this is again confirmed because the biologist sees figures entering the tunnel later on. But in any case, she ends up going back to the tunnel. This time...
Well, she's also at this point, after that encounter, she's injured and she's self-healing.
Yes. Yeah, and she's got a glow to her at this point, too. You mentioned the bioluminescence. So, I mean, she is her own light through a lot of this heading down the tunnel. And, she's been shot twice and is seemingly fine, which is another sign that, okay, something's going on. And, she has this need. It's not even a desire or anything. She needs to go down there now. And I
think this is most in alignment with the need for the psychologist to not shoot her. This is when we start to see more and more of the pressure of this environment controlling individuals like puppets.
Mm-hmm. And she heads down, and she meets what it is that's writing on the walls, and oh boy.
Yeah.
You talk about unknowable. So, I mean, we get multiple descriptions of the being that is down there.
Yeah.
Everything from just a creation of... I can't remember which shape it is, but it's essentially a creation of prisms and the like to a gigantic thing on cilia with an arm and glowing halos rotating it at three different points.
I think that, and I think that our difficulty in explaining the description of it is a good indicator of how well Jeff Vandermeer did writing this description. Mm-hmm. Like you come away from it with that thing that Lovecraft only described obliquely. So when Lovecraft would describe like Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep or any of the weird, crazy elder gods, he'd discuss more the effect they had on the person, where they were an unknowable thing that you couldn't comprehend, and so your brain kind of falls apart. In this, what Vandermeer has done is he's given a description that doesn't work. And so your brain's putting these different written descriptions together, and it's not, you can't go, oh yeah, it was this.
Yeah.
You just can't do that. So he actually infests your brain with this unknowableness in a fantastically pleasurable way.
If you've
like
ever,
as a reader, it's
and if you
joyful.
have read this book, do yourself a favor and do a search on images just for the fan art or the different art of the
Oh, is
crawler
there?
that
I'm going
people
to do
have
that
made.
right now.
There's a fair amount, and essentially none of it's wrong because it's so unknowable and the descriptions vary so much. I will leave this tidbit in terms of before we get to the film in the next episode, but Vandermeer has said the film depiction of the crawler is one of the more accurate, despite the fact that it doesn't have legs. It doesn't actually crawl in the film, but he says that it's one of the better depictions he's seen of it, which is interesting.
Interesting, yeah.
But yeah, there's a number of different pictures.
Annihilation crawler fan art, and just click images, and it's so weird. This is crazy stuff.
If you don't feel like sleeping, it's a great. Oh wait.
Yeah, if you want to live in a fever dream for a little while, I highly recommend this when you have a fever of about 104.
I was gonna say if you have an infection, so if you're like me and my wife. While I'm recording this, it's a great time to look that up because you're already high off meds and everything else. So, hey, have a good time. But yeah, she encounters the crawler, and at points it actually becomes invisible to her. You talked about that, the cosmic horror aspects and things being indescribable. At points, it's indescribable in the sense that she can't even see it. It just becomes, there's nothing there, and her senses betray her, and she is just sort of in awe of this, and she ends up trying to crawl away. And it's at this point is the scene that I alluded to earlier of that inversion of being studied, because the crawler pins her down and sort of enters and remakes her over and over again in every sense of the word. Again, it's fairly indescribable. She describes things like her bones being crushed to powder and then being put back together and then exploding again.
Yeah.
And it's just that sense of, she describes the feeling of being the starfish in a pool and having her, the biologist, look over you. She feels now that she is the starfish and the crawler is the giant biologist that is beyond her understanding but is studying her.
And I think the starfish is a deliberate choice, since they can lose limbs or parts, and then those parts go into new starfish, as does the original. Like there's something there for the reason the starfish was chosen, I think, because it's very much what this environment is doing. And there's another revelation Lusher has in there about what or who the crawler originally was. Right? That's why she's being pulled apart.
So she heads down after this because it's the only way she can go. She doesn't want to see the crawler ever again. She survives this, and there's a door at the bottom made of light, but she gets sick as she gets closer and closer to it. So she realizes she won't survive the experience, so she ends up having to go back up. She passes by the crawler without incident on the way back up. It has no interest in her. But she turns around, and she sees the face of the lighthouse keeper from the photo, to the point that later on, when she returns to camp, she looks at it over and over again as if it was going to change, or as if her perception or something would have changed of him. But she sees him, and she sees at the same time this sort of agony within him, but she still sees him as 30 years younger, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And she gets a feeling of joy from him at the same time. So again, it's another sort of unknowable mixture of everything.
And we don't know which feelings are hers now and which are being kind of broadcast, I guess you'd say, from the land and the stuff in it into them.
Yeah, she's fully
Or into
into
her, at least, and
Area.
then
Yeah,
others that are
Area
down
X has fully sort of transformed her at this point. She's glowing.
there.
She,
Yeah,
her
yeah.
wounds don't seem to really matter. And yeah, she returns to camp at this
So,
point. It's at this point that she
yeah,
reads. Oh, go ahead.
yeah. Yeah, it's her husband's journal. Like, it's this
Yeah.
really strange ending because you have this climactic confrontation, rebuild, restructure of a person, this subsuming of an individual into some other kind of entity space where she's recognized by Area X. They leave that door that's glowing alone, and instead of taking or trying for that because it makes her sick, she reads her husband's journal. She sits down and goes through it and is finding out what he thought about the expedition, where he went, what he did, and how he felt about her in some parts of it.
Yeah.
And then that makes her decide to follow him.
Yeah, we get
and
no answers at all.
And it's weird because she's pretty sure, she is pretty sure that both he, the actual he, is dead. Whatever came out that wasn't him but was him is also dead. So she's not going to find him. She's actually looking for more of an experience of who he was. And this is like the end of her second arc. Hold on, let me find. There's a really good quote. Okay, yeah. So the biologist arc, earlier on, when she's still pretty in control of her stuff, she says, "I loved him, but I didn't need him." This is what she's talking about when he came back from nowhere, and he's a nothing person. I loved him, but I didn't need him. And now at this point, at the end, after she's sitting there and kind of processing it, she's reevaluating the relationship, and she says, "I could have met him part way and retained my sovereignty." And it's a really interesting quote in light of how much she's lost of her sovereignty at this point. So the relationship she had with her husband is an allegory for the overtaking of her by the natural forces, to the point where at the end she wants to follow her husband, I think, to try and regain some of her sovereignty that she's losing. But I think she's doing that because she's lost her sovereignty. Like, it's such a weird
you got
bit
all
of
that.
character. Yeah, I mean, like that feels like it's the arc, is that her being taken over lets her reevaluate her ability to be independent in a relationship. It's just it's so weird.
It's such an odd book. There's so many. It's interesting because the book, ostensibly, I mean, it's about nature, and it's about nature and our relationship with it. And nature, in a lot of ways, taking back what we have taken from it. But at the core of it, there's so much relationship stuff just from the relationships we have with each other at the same time as with nature, that it's crazy to me how much is packed in these. When I looked it up, I had to wonder if I was having a fever dream that this was 127 pages, because this book has stayed with me for so long after I've read it. It's been years, and I still sort of go back and I think about it. And every time there's a new one that comes out, I reread it. And Annihilation, you said it earlier, by the way, I wholeheartedly recommend people to read this. Your mileage may vary regarding the rest of the books. I think they're absolutely fascinating in the way they decide to not adhere to the previous books in terms of genre and in terms of how they are written. They vary wildly.
Interesting. So I haven't read them, but
this
is having enjoyed Annihilation as much as I do,
I recommend reading them.
I want to read more Southern Reach.
Yeah, I mean, give it a try. It's not going to be for everyone. They are very polarizing, much more so than Annihilation. And personally, I do think Annihilation is the best book. And if you're going to read one and just stop, I think that's perfectly fine. For me, I wanted to go on. I think for me it was a little easier to go on too, because I hinted at it earlier, and this is why I said the specific title. I'm a huge fan of The Expanse. I can't see it. I've got the Kickstartered Rocinante up on the shelf.
Oh yeah, nice.
Up on the bookshelf somewhere behind me. Anyway, those books vary the viewpoint from book to book. They change who the narrator is, and in fact, later books, they just have multiple narrators. They also change genre. The first book is a noir, detective noir set in a science fiction setting. The second book is a Western. The fourth book is a Western. The second book is a political thriller. And so on and so on. Like the fifth book is a disaster movie put to page. It's fascinating. So I was a little more open to the shift in terms of narrators, narration, and how it's told, but I was desperate to learn more about the organization that oversees Area X, this sort of Southern Reach area, and who looks at it. And I was hoping for answers on some of the mysteries or the things we've talked about, like what is the door, what is the crawler, that kind of thing. And if you're looking for answers, good luck with that.
Yeah. See, so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about this in terms of like how Stephen King over the years built out the Institute. Like it first shows up in like Firestarter, right?
Yeah.
So Firestarter, the little girl in that, was a program of having two psychically gifted people. You've been chosen to be together, have a child, and we're going to raise it in the Institute. To eventually you have the men in yellow coats, and you have this whole place that's devoted to finding these people to be breakers for the Dark Tower. And the narrative and the story of it, it unspools to an unfathomable degree.
Yeah.
But in reading this, the organization that's sending people into X, I'm really curious about. And
it's very similar.
I'll read more.
You will definitely get answers, but you will also definitely be getting more questions. And it's done.
Okay.
I don't know. It's done in a way that I find satisfying, but it's not going to be for everybody. And you mentioned that Annihilation can be kind of polarizing. I just don't get. I've read the negative reviews, and I mean, I don't really get them. I understand at least the negative reviews.
If you're pretty focused on reading, like, you know, Robert Ludlum and the Da Vinci Code and stuff that's super spelled out and just kind of facts, solve. You're not going to enjoy this because it's not going to do that.
So you're saying we're doing the Da Vinci Code next? Oh.
No, I don't. I'm perfectly okay leaving that one on the shelf.
Okay. Well,
I do think it would be fun just to go through and kind of tear it open, just because I never understood why you have a guy who's at Harvard who's a symbologist. Like, that's not a thing. What the hell is that?
It could be worse.
And who also swims a lot, like a dolphin. Like, it was so much.
It could be worse. You could have Mark Wahlberg as an inventor for your film, or you go the Michael Bay route. Oh, anyway. No, and Annihilation was. Yeah. Annihilation was just so much fun for me to read, and like I say, I fully recommend it to everybody. There's so much stuff we didn't even cover. You know, for example, the biologist sees a dolphin that has a human eye. Yeah. And it looks at her and it knows her. Yeah. She studies matter taken from the crawler and discovers that it's made up of human brain cells. And it's the same sort of tissue that make up our brains.
It's so fascinating. It's so weird.
There's just item after item that is absolutely fascinating that you want to read more. And so, yeah, there was no way I wasn't reading the rest of the trilogy at the time.
So there's two other books that this reminded me of a little bit. One and this is specifically because of the tower tunnel inversion thing, and that's the whole motif of Dante's Inferno, which is you have to go down to get back up. Like, you have to go down through all 7 layers of hell before you leave them. You can't go backwards. You can only go one way through. And then the other one, have you ever read House of Leaves?
Yes, and I'm trying to remember the
It's
context that
by
you're going
Poe's brother. Oh, because there's the House of Leaves is this nested narrative about stuff that never existed, and at the very root of it is these films that were recorded
Yeah.
by an architect in their house with rooms that don't exist, and that book gave no answers, and it doesn't
Yeah.
give answers, and it has this strangeness to the underlying facts which don't make sense.
So
Like it's a
yeah.
documentarian that doesn't exist. It's a house that doesn't exist.
It's interesting you bring that up because the
It's
House of Leaves comparison is more apt to one of the later books in this series. That's why I was sort of
does
confused.
he do a weird structure thing? Because I'm excited for that.
Yeah, that's why I was confused because I thought to myself, okay, so has he actually read further and he doesn't remember, and then that's
No,
no, you haven't. So okay, that is the context. Yeah. So anyway,
that's exciting.
it's a more apt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things
Cool.
about this book is that it'll make you want to read more if you're one of those people that is, I think, naturally curious and you want to look for answers. Although having said that too, this book was released in 2014. It's been 10 years. There are so many excellent video essays or long form essays you can read about it. Not to mention you can read, Vandermeer's own commentary regarding it in the years since to kind of get some sort of understanding of the context or some of the things he's going for. And yeah, it's fascinating to me. I can't wait to hit the movie again to discuss the differences and the similarities.
Yeah.
Because the book is so...
Well, I'm looking forward to reading or watching it now. Because I've watched it for quite a while, probably since it came out.
It'll make you want to read the book again, probably.
And probably. I'm going to be in an endless cycle, just going back and forth like a weird metronome. I will say this for people that are thinking about reading it. If you liked reading Lovecraft and the weird prose he had and the uncomfortable feeling you got in like Rats in the Walls and Music of Eric Zahn, this will capture that in a very modern space and without the problematic baggage of H.P. Lovecraft. And to this point, we don't know. We don't know that Jeff Vandermeer has any of Lovecraft's problems, but all indications say no. So I don't think that you'll have that.
Books about, nature and our relationship and some of the awful things we've done to it. So I'd say probably not.
Yeah,
but
it's much more founded in natural catastrophe than racism. So that's helpful.
Yeah. There's a lot of science to it as well, too. Although having said that, I will say the science was plausible to me as a person who is, I feel like, a scientific mind. But if you were someone who was actually a biologist and you read this, you would probably want to throw the book against the wall because the biologist kind of goes off the wall pretty quickly. But again, that's the influence of the area.
Yeah. Yeah, blame it on the glow.
Yeah.
Whenever you've got a problem, it's the crawler or the glow. Somebody
the brightness's fault. It wasn't me. It was the brightness.
So I think it was the one-armed brightness. It was the 12-armed brightness.
Yeah.
I think this is a good spot to kind of leave it for the film. Do you have any last thoughts or last thematic ideas or suggestions or anything you feel like we need to cover before we wrap up?
No, I love this book. If you've watched the movie and haven't read the book, read the book. If you've read the book, go out and watch the movie.
Yeah.
Just consider them very separate entities. And I'll leave with this sort of theme, I guess, too, thematically. The director of the film, which of course is Alex Garland, commented that he wanted the movie to essentially be a dream version of having read the book. He chose not to reread the book before directing the film. And while it's obvious that I think probably some people on the staff... Yeah, I think it's obvious that some people on the staff did reread the book because there are similarities. But he's right. It feels almost like a fever dream of the other. And that's why I feel like both work. And that's definitely something we'll get into, but it evokes the same set of feelings for me, which I feel as though it's funny because more so than I'd argue I've watched what you've done on the show, more so than what else has been talked about on this show, I'd argue this gets into the heart of what is an adaptation. How do you adapt a book? Is it just, page for page? Yeah. Is it the look? Or do you try to just invoke the feelings of the reader?
So I'm super excited to have that discussion around Annihilation, because the other one that I think that I want to do on here eventually that's in that same bucket is the movie adaptation, which is ostensibly an adaptation of the novel by the New York Times journalist, but it's actually an adaptation of Robert McKee's story. Like, it's super weird how they do it too. And so I'm really interested to get into that conversation. We'll jump into that.
It's one of those things that's always been fascinating to me, because I'm always interested in entertainment in general too. And you have all these books, right? We've all read books and we go, oh, you could never make a movie of that. For the longest time, Lord of the Rings was unadaptable, or you've got all this different stuff that's considered, oh, you could never do that. No. Well, it turns out you can.
Yeah. Turns out you can. Turns out Peter Jackson can.
Yeah. Well, the right person can.
With that said, with that said, Ryan, you want to plug your pluggables? Tell the people where they can find you.
Sure. So we are a UpNerd podcast network. You can find us just at UpNerd. We're on Blue Sky mainly now at this point, mercifully. It's upnerdpodcast.bsky.social. You can also email us. But we have a YouTube channel as well where we adapt, and more adaptations, where we adapt some of the podcast episodes and put them up on YouTube. But mainly we're a podcast. We can be found at upnerd.captivate.fm. You can listen to, we've got a ton of episodes. We did Annihilation. You can cheat and listen to that to possibly hear some of my thoughts. But having said that, I did that show with my wife, who has not read the books, so I did not bring them up at all.
Why hasn't she read the books yet? You got to get her on that.
She hadn't seen the movie. So the show, we have two different shows. There's Fine You Pick, where the film is chosen by the other person, and we try to pick a movie that the other person hasn't watched. And Annihilation was one that just came to me because we were in this sort of hoity-toity, upbrow science fiction phase. And so I thought, oh, she hasn't seen Annihilation. We should definitely watch that. She hadn't seen Alien, by the way, when we did it. So there's some weird... Cool. She's a huge sci-fi fan.
Did you do that one?
Oh, yeah, no, we did Alien for sure. She's a huge sci-fi fan, but there's some weird sort of blank spots because she wasn't allowed to watch certain things when she was younger. Yeah. So, that's one of our shows. The other one is Top 3, Bottom 3, where we look at the highest rated episodes on IMDb of a series, and we watch the top 3. Then we watch the bottom 3, the 3 worst rated episodes on IMDb, and try to figure out if people are crazy or not. Spoiler alert, usually they are so far.
I'm going to check both of those out. All right, everybody, you can go find Ryan. We will also leave links in the description or in the show notes, depending on where you're listening to this. You found me, so I don't need to tell you where to find me. I'm also on Blue Sky. I forget my tag, but I will put it in the things so you have it. Thanks again, Ryan. Everybody have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.